So welcome everybody. My name's Greta. I'm the Development Manager at the Organic Growers Alliance. We're hosting tonight's event on agroforestry and organic horticulture. This webinar is actually part of a bigger programme of online events that's running this year and next year. It's part funded by Farming the Future, and it's a collaboration between the organisations you see at the bottom of the screen there. So there's the OGA, there's the Community Supported Agriculture Network, there's the Seeds Sovereignty Programme at the Gaia Foundation, and the Land Workers Alliance. And they are all fabulous organisations doing great work. So if you're not familiar with any or all of them, please do check them out, join, get involved, support them in any way you can. A couple of quick bits of webinar admin before we start. You'll see there's a chat function live tonight, so we'd love it if you would get involved there. Introduce yourself, let us know where you're from. And also, if there's anything that you've read or seen or places you've visited that have inspired you or taught you something about agroforestry, please do also share that in the chat so we can benefit from all the different levels of knowledge in the room. When you're using the chat, make sure you've got it set to send to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what you're sharing. And the other thing to tell you is there's a separate Q&A function. So we are planning to have some time for questions from the audience for the speakers at the end. So if you could pop your questions in the separate Q&A box, that would really help us keep things running smoothly. I think that's it for the admin side of things. So let's get started. The first person I want to introduce you to is Ben Raskin. Ben is the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. He's also a volunteer director at the Organic Growers Alliance. And best of all, he's a very experienced grower and a huge enthusiast for agroforestry. So we're delighted to have him here with some of his several hats on at one go. Ben, if you're ready, let me pass over to you.
Thank you, Greta. I will just attempt to share my screen. Is that showing all right? Great. Hello, good evening, everybody. So Greta's asked me to just sort of give, I guess, an overview and an introduction to both to agroforestry, but in the context, obviously, of organic horticulture. My original background was as a vegetable grower or with some fruit on the side. And I started getting interested in agroforestry probably about 10, 12 years ago, and actually set up a very small two acre agroforestry horticultural site just south of Bristol. Unfortunately, the landlord went bust, and I had to rip out all the trees, and it was all very sad. But it did coincide with the birth of my second son, so the trees became less important, and I think there's still a few of the trees floating about somewhere in Somerset in bits of fields. But it was a good experience going through the planning process, and it got me interested in sort of some of the finer points. And that coincided, I guess, with the Soil Association's desire to do more on agroforestry. And I sort of put my hand up to lead on that, and that's led to quite a lot of work, and obviously there's a lot of interest in it now. So one of the things that we've done at the Soil Association is create the Agroforestry Handbook, which I imagine a lot of you have seen. If not, you can still download it from the Soil Association website. But then independently, about 5 years ago, I started working with Helen Browning at her farm in Wiltshire, and we're setting up, we're planning about 200 acres of agroforestry eventually is the plan. So we've done about 80 acres so far. That's not a horticultural operation. It's at the moment mainly dairy, young stock, silver pasture system. Although we've got quite a lot of fruit and nut trees, which obviously I guess you could class as horticultural. And I've also become a bit obsessed with wood chip. So we're using a lot of wood chip for mulching. And I was involved with the Organic Research Centre's project on ramial wood chip, So actually just this weekend, I'm submitting my draft of a wood chip book. So I think there's some quite interesting connections to be made there with trees and using the trees in horticulture. So that's sort of a little bit about me. I don't intend to sort of go too much into sort of what agroforestry is. I'm hoping that most people have a basic understanding. If not, do stick stuff in the Q&A or the chat, and we can sort of discuss it. But I mean, it's using woody perennials intentionally with other farming crops and enterprises. And I guess why it's interesting and why I'm excited about it is it's all about that sort of maximizing of resources, light, water, soil, nutrients, all of these things that effectively are free if we can capture them properly. And monocrops and annual crops particularly waste quite a lot of those nutrients. I mean, even just looking at this picture here, which is, it's a lovely picture, but you can see quite a lot of bare soil. All of the light and water that's hitting that soil, most of that is going to be, a lot of that will be wasted. It'll be reflected back up, or it might drain away. And most annual crops have relatively shallow roots, so they're only using the top layer of the soils. So it's about making better use of the resources we've got, and to, I guess, steal a phrase from the other camp, it's proper sustainable intensification. It is genuinely getting more out of what we've already got. Oh, hang on, that hasn't gone forward. There we go. So this idea, sort of the woody plants bit, and I guess most growers have got some fruit in their system, whether it's a few apple trees or soft fruit bushes. But certainly when I started, they were in a separate area often. I'd have my soft fruit area and my orchard area, and it didn't sort of occur to me really that you might integrate them. But actually, by interspersing them across that whole growing area, you can get some really good benefits. So just a couple of examples. Tree crops suffer from diseases often, and apples obviously particularly from scab. If you can space the lines further apart and potentially the trees further apart in the rows, then you reduce that risk of disease. And you can see in this picture we've got here, I mean, although that's actually an arable crop, there's for a disease to get across from one row to the other is going to be quite hard. Most of those spores will be blown off into the air. So it slows down the spread of disease through an orchard. Obviously, you've got the strip where the trees are is a habitat that encourages predators and pollinators that can be useful for your crops in between, and just the soil health that you build up under the trees can benefit the area between the crop too. The leaves from the trees will drop and be incorporated. You've got increased fungal populations under the trees. All of that stuff will help feed into the strips between the trees. Not to mention, of course, the wind and sun protection that you get from the trees. And the temperature between a row of trees can be as much as 4 or 5 degrees higher than it would be without that protection, which means you might be able to plant a crop earlier or harvest it later, or perhaps even grow a crop in an area that you might not otherwise have thought of growing a crop. So it opens up some options. So I thought what I'd do is just kind of have a think about a few examples of systems where you can fit those woody plants and horticultural crops together. So I mentioned fruit trees. And obviously, if we're growing veg and selling it to, our customers will want to buy fruit as well as the veg. So it's a really useful extra income to the vegetables. This is an example. This is Riverford, where Guy Watson's obsession with artichokes, he's included into a agroforestry system. He's gone for, for trees. The one that I set up, I was espaliering them. So I was having quite controlled rows of maybe sort of 8 foot high apple trees, but quite narrow training. And the advantage with that is you can be very productive in a small space. So they are, although they're quite a lot of work of pruning, and you often need to do summer pruning, which is a bit of a challenge sometimes if you've got a lot of other crops coming at that time of year, you can get a really high yield from those systems from a relatively small space. But actually, they can be any height. A colleague of mine was going on a train through Italy and looked out the window and he saw a massive field of broad beans separated every kind of 10 meters or so by a single step over apple tree, just a foot from the ground. So they were really creating no competition to that crop at all. And the broad beans obviously would be harvested relatively early, leaving the apples to ripen with the sun afterwards. So they're very flexible as to how you can prune, certainly apples and pears, to fit into almost any space without necessarily competing heavily with the crops. The other sort of useful way of managing trees is short rotation coppice. So this is an example from Wakelands, where they're growing potatoes between, I think, hazel. The advantage here obviously is that you're cutting them continuously, so you're not getting a big tree that's going to shade out and compete. Alan Schofield, a previous chairman of the OGA, had a very established pollarded alder agroforestry system, and he developed a really complex rotation where he'd worked out which crops did the best immediately after the pollarding, which ones did better with the semi-shading, and which could still cope when the trees were getting bigger. And not only that, but within that bed, he worked out which ones he needed to plant in the middle of the bed in each year and which ones at the edge of the bed. And obviously the advantage with alder is it's nitrogen fixing. So you're getting he used to cut the main branch, the logs for his fire, and then just leave the brash in the row. And obviously that would break down, absorbed into the soil, and that would help to feed the crops in between. So that's a really useful way. And certainly with me thinking now about sort of how we can use wood chip more, there's a potential for potentially coppicing and chipping the ramial wood chip from these short rotations straight into the alley to boost the soil health and the rows between. So there's, it reduces the transport and composting potentially. The other bit is obviously not forgetting the space between the trees. This is Tolleasy and Tolhurst's place in Berkshire. I think he's actually had to give up on the rhubarb now because he's got soil diseases that have killed them off, but they look quite good in this row. But how can you use every bit of space to provide not just that sort of habitat environment, but also something that you can sell, and effectively sort of squeezing every inch out of it. I think he also tried daffodils and other things, but at Eastbrook we've been putting mainly soft fruit in between our top fruit trees, so we've been doing it that way, but we're a slightly less intensive system. You can do it under plastic, and this is Nathan Richards over in West Wales, who is really successfully growing peaches and apricots in tunnels, where where he is so wet and windy. He'd have no hope of growing those outside. And what he's finding, in this picture, he's growing strawberries underneath, but he's got it as part of his tunnel rotation. And he's finding they're doing really well and not competing with the other tunnel crops particularly. Obviously he's lost a row from the middle, but he's finding that it's working well. And I think you could do apricots, peaches, cherries, figs even. So there's lots of opportunities for integrating in the cover, and it might even help in some cases to provide shade for some of those other crops when it's really hot in the summer. And it's worth, I guess, I know we're probably mostly vegetable growers here. I don't know if that's true, but there are ways of doing the fruit without the veg, and using animals. I was trying to come up with some nice alliteration for all of these. I mean, poultry are superb under trees. It's great for the hens. Sheep is possible, particularly as they get bigger, and Shropshire sheep are, reputedly don't eat trees. They will if there's not much else, but if you keep them well enough fed on other interesting stuff, they tend to leave the trees alone. Pigs, but perhaps, and Andy, who's talking later, I know has dabbled with this, so he may want to cover it, but the trick is to move them very quickly and have them in for very short periods. And personally, I would, we are growing peri pears in our this final one is Eastbrook, where Helen's farm, where we're doing the trees, and we've put quite a lot of peri pears in. But obviously they're going to get really big, and we've got electric fencing here to keep the cows off. But it's on smaller trees that you need to harvest by hand, I wouldn't put cows anywhere near them. So that's my little quick go through, and I've left goats off for obvious reasons, because they're a really bad idea with trees. So that's my my short introduction. We have got a really good Facebook group, Agroforestry UK, which is sponsored by the Fab Farmers project, and then Fabulous Farmers, Functional Agricultural Biodiversity. So that's a whole range of practices that help the farm as well, compost and green manures and cover crops and things, but agroforestry is one of those. So do look that up if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Welsh peaches is new to me. That's quite exciting.
I mean, he says they're relatively profitable for the space they're taking up. So and no problem selling them.
Thank you. The next person that I'm going to introduce you to is John Tucker. John is the Director of Woodland Outreach at the Woodland Trust, as you can see, and he's going to take us through some of the more practical considerations you might want to think about when you're planning your own projects. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Greta. Evening, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks, Ben, for a really good introduction. So I'm just going to have a whistle-stop tour around some of the key things to think about when you're planning agroforestry. It's really just to whet your appetite. Not going to go into detail about any particular area. I'll be talking about what they call silvopastoral as well as silvo-arable. So that's some trees and animals and some trees and crops. But it's just about getting people to think about the principles. So me, I've come from the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess, to Ben. I studied forestry many, many years ago. Very much sort of commercial forestry, but it's probably the last 8 odd years, agroforestry really excites me. And I just wish I was about 20 years younger, but hey ho, we can't have everything. So the first thing to say is really, don't be fazed by the term agroforestry. It kind of, you meet people and you think, oh God, agroforestry, what the hell's that? Kind of puts them off right at the first hurdle. But for me, it's anybody who's doing anything to do with trees. So if you plant a hedge like this and you've got fields next to it, you're doing agroforestry. So don't get too worried about that. There are lots of different ways of doing it, lots of different layouts and systems. You can go from something like these caged individual trees up at Rydal Hall. Not a very good picture down at the bottom, but you can see in the far distance, it's Lowther Estates, got a fantastic wood pasture system that they're developing, very much scattered trees. And you can see from the diagram, there's all sorts of different layouts that you can consider. I guess when you're considering sort of silvo-arable or horticultural based systems, that you'll want some regularity with machinery involved, with picking involved, etc. You want to have some regularity and system to them. So you'll probably be thinking about more systems like this. I was interested to see on the chat some people from Dartington. You'll probably recognize the picture on the left. There's Szechuan peppers, elderflower in there. And of course, probably the most photogenic and photographed agroforestry system in the UK, Stephen Briggs, on the right near Peterborough. So there all sorts of systems and layouts are possible. So I guess thinking about agroforestry, there are two key things you've got to think about. The first is, what are your objectives? And I'll run through some of the objectives and benefits from agroforestry, but you've really got to be clear what you want to get out of both the tree element and the system as a whole. And then the second thing is to really make sure you understand the site itself and the system and how it's going to fit into your farm business. And there are two other things then. Seek advice. I guess nobody knows all the answers, lots of different ways of doing things. You know, I'm still learning every day. You talk to somebody, you find something else out. So seek advice and give yourself plenty of time to plan. It's really important to get the planning right. You can make lots of mistakes and it will cost you time in the long term if you don't get it right. And I've learnt that by bitter experience, I have to say, and goats comes to mind. So just briefly, thinking about some of the objectives, and apologies if this is sort of not new to many of you, but I do think it's worth just quickly running through some of the benefits that trees can offer. UK loses a huge amount of topsoil every year, 2.9 million tonnes annually. No idea how they actually come up with that figure, but it seems like a lot. Windblown as here, Cambridgeshire fens, but a lot of it is, of course, waterborne, washed down into rivers and streams with ongoing problems then for biodiversity, fish stocks and so on. But it's a cost to the farmer. It's your most important part of your soil, the most valuable part that you're losing. You know, and apologies again for teaching people to suck eggs, but it's again just worth thinking about why trees can make a difference. Obviously, the soil, the structure of the tree above ground is going to act as a windbreak. That's pretty straightforward. In terms of runoff, the structure of the tree is going to both intercept rain and slow it up as it hits the ground. And I guess most importantly, though, is what's happening underground. It's the roots of the trees, how they make the structure more porous, how the organic matter from the leaves will help improve the soil. And I guess something we're beginning to understand more about is how root penetration, both lower down, is going to bring up more minerals, and about the role that tree roots and mycorrhiza can start to play. Reading and meeting somebody like Merlin Sheldrake, thinking about mycorrhiza, I think they've got a huge contribution to make that we just don't realize very much about them at the moment. So trees, soil structure, really important. And just a couple of pictures of some practical, examples of how trees have helped improve soil erosion, water quality. One from Chapel Beck up in Cumbria, you can see top left how badly eroded the site is. A lot of the soil is just going to end up in the river. There's some really good salmon rivers in this part of the world, and salmon numbers were diminishing as water quality was diminishing. But 5 years on, you can see things like goat willow planted, alder. If the banks are fenced off, it allows natural regeneration to come in as well. And it soon has improvements on both soil erosion and water quality. And you can see another example, Forest of Bowland, a really big dairy area up in Lancashire, severe erosion problems, soil problems going into the water, really in lots of nitrate going into the water system as well. 6 years on, fenced off, planted, naturally regenerated, really makes a difference quite quickly. But turning to something which probably more interest to people here, and something that Ben has touched on already, the impact of trees as a windbreak. You can see on the left-hand side kind of a very traditional windbreak, Lombardy poplar over an arable field. probably not the best sort of windbreak. You know, we're learning now about perhaps less tall ones, wider, more of a structure to it in terms of having a shrub layer as well as a tree layer, not making them completely windproof, but allowing some porosity for some wind to go through. But just showing the impacts, the graph on the right-hand side and the two pictures from some work by Jo Smith. She has an open arable field as a control and an agroforestry field with a strip of trees running down the middle. And you can see quite clearly the blue line is the control, so the wind speeds are much higher than the red line, which is the agroforestry system. And as Ben mentioned earlier, lots of implications for things like winter chill. So the winter chill in the agroforestry is much less. And some really interesting impacts in terms of transpiration rates. So as you're shutting down the wind speed across the crop with the trees, transpiration rates are lower, so water usage can be more efficient. And of course, with climate change, that's going to be a really interesting area to research more in the future. Just touching on a few other things, thinking about adaptation to climate change, role of trees for shade and shelter. On the left, you can see a typical summer's day, sheep seeking shelter under a tree. And then on the right is a piece of work that we're doing with Bangor University. Those are actually life-size sheep. There's plastic stuffed full of thermal monitoring gear. And the object of the work is to work out what the impacts of differing layers of shelter are on the energy uptake and usage of those sheep. So if you can provide them with more shelter, they're having to use less energy and trying to keep warm. And then live weight gain is speeded up. They can put more of their energy into putting on weight, essentially. And of course, if you think about knock-ons for outdoor lambing and the importance of shelter, particularly in the first 48 hours of when lambs are born, shelter can really reduce mortality losses quite significantly. Something that, again, Ben's touched on, thinking about other options for crops that you might get with your trees, short rotation coppice. I think it's the same picture of Wakelin's, Martin Wolf's hazel coppice. He was cutting on a 2-year cycle and getting really good growth rates, regrowth rates from the coppice, using the coppice for his biomass boiler in the farm setup. We've got more traditional willow coppice on the top right, and then top left, and then the bottom left, cricketback willow, which I think is obviously can't grow it everywhere in the country. It's more of a southern, southwestern sort of tree, but you know, you can get really good returns on it in probably 16, 18 years, wide space, so you can do a lot of things underneath it. It's high pruned, so you don't get knots in the bats. So I think it could be a tree that could be much more used in agroforestry than it currently is. Just thinking about a couple of other things. Pollination, you know, it's really important. But when people think about pollination, for some reason, they don't think very much about trees. I live down in Sussex, goat willow, just about starting to come out in flower now. It's out at a time, you know, it's a source of pollen and nectar when very few other things are out. So trees can provide a source of pollination right the way across the year virtually. And then we're doing some really interesting research about the role of tree fodder, things like willow for salicylic acid. Willow's also really good for cobalt, can be a shortage of cobalt for weaning lambs in the summer when there's a lack of cobalt in grass. So things to think about. This is some cut willow, working with Tim Downs, an organic dairy farmer over on the Shropshire border. He's growing willow to feed to his cattle. And then finally, before I move on to some more planning issues, just think about a few other diversifications. We've got John Lee Pemberton's apricots, down at the bottom. This was taken probably 5 or 6 years ago. He had about 8 acres of them then, doing very well. Sea buckthorn, grown commercially now, but it's a native shrub. Grows on the coast really well where I live. And then some white mulberries from my own garden. Had a really good crop this year. And then if you're thinking about using trees, you obviously think about the carbon value of them, but you can, I think, start to think about getting some financial return from that carbon value as well. We've got the Woodland Carbon Guarantee now launched by the Forestry Commission. Currently, yes, it's very much aimed at woodland, so traditional sort of 2 metre spaced large blocks of woodland, but we are talking to the Carbon Code about getting much lower density planting, typical of agroforestry systems, into the Carbon Code system. Oh, finally, gosh, truffles. Black truffles, yes, we are experimenting with them. We have planted some truffle inoculated trees. Have we had any truffles yet? No, but I live in hope. Most of the truffles around the world, black truffles certainly, are actually from cultivated trees rather than out in the wild. But it's quite an investment. That little oak tree that you see in the middle there, if it was uninoculated with truffles, would probably cost around 30p. When it's been inoculated, it will probably cost you about 25 or 30 quid. So it's quite an investment. So thinking about the planning issues then, so you've thought about your objectives, all those lovely benefits, and you've thought, yes, I'm going to, get some trees into my system. What do I need to think about? Well, you've really got to understand your site first of all. So think about issues like soil critically, what's the structure like? What's the mineral content like? Dig holes, get your hands dirty, get a spade out. What's the drainage like? You may think that the picture shown there is not a particularly enticing looking field, and you'd be right. It's actually a landfill site down near Lewis. But the process is obviously the same. Understand your soils. I've put the picture down in the bottom because really think about the area in which you live. Think about what's growing there, drainage systems, where the how exposed it is, what the topography is like, where the wind direction comes from. All of those will point what sort of tree species you might be able to grow, what sort of crops you might be able to grow there. So take time to understand the site that you're on. The picture on the top right is actually, it's some tree roots that have been taken out of a field drain. And one of the things I always tell people, understand what's underneath in terms of services, but also what's overhead in terms of services. So things like telephone lines, cables, all sorts. Make sure you're not planting under them, or if you are, that you've got a management system to keep their size to a manageable level so it's not going to affect those services. And think about field drains. Some people might not mind them getting interrupted, others will. So you need to understand where they are, what form they are, what condition they're in. Worth sort of trying to put all of that knowledge down onto a map. This is actually a site appraisal plan. It's actually for a new woodland planting, but it's the same principles. So just mark out everything that you've got, access, services, existing woodland, existing trees, topography, slope, all those sorts of things. Get it down onto a plan so you can gives you something to think about, to talk with other people about what might work and what won't work. And then it's a case of trying to bring your objectives together and the site details together. So what sort of things are you going to be thinking about? Tree species, huge amount of species that can do all sorts of things. Lots of people have talked about fruit and nut species, things like alder for its nitrogen fixing, lots of other things. Robinia can be a really good tree in terms of its timber, but can be a bit invasive, but worth thinking about. All sorts of things. So lots of opportunities there. Density and spacing. How far apart are you going to plant those trees? what's the spacing going to be like in between your rows? You've got to allow for management of the crop that's growing in between, management of access to get both tree crops and crops that are growing in between, in and out, planted, maintained. Orientation. I saw a question earlier just before I was starting of somebody asking, does everything have to be planted north and south? Well, no, is the answer. And the reason why a lot of things are planted north and south is because that will allow you to get the maximum amount of sunlight on the crop. And it's the orientation where the trees will have the least impact on the crop that's growing in between. So, but you may have, if you've got objectives around a windbreak, then obviously the orientation is going to be determined by the direction that the prevailing wind is coming from. So it doesn't have to be north and south, but there are good reasons for it being so. Protection. I still have, vivid memories of goats and problems that I've had with them. They will get everywhere and anywhere. And you might think that if you're planting horticultural vegetable crops, you don't really need to think about protecting your trees. I can't really think of anywhere in the UK really that's not suffering problems with either rabbits or deer in particular. So you will need to think about what animals you might have in your particular area and how you're going to protect against them. They can cause huge amounts of damage. Even things like voles can be a problem as well. I've seen sort of woodland type crops really decimated by vole populations. So really understanding what's in your area and what you need to do to protect against it is really important. Think about the ground cover underneath your trees. Most sort of alley crop systems have 2 or 3 meters of ground underneath those trees. Obviously, if you've got bare earth there, it's going to attract weeds, which are not going to be a great combination for your vegetable or horticultural crops. So lots of people use either further crops, as Ben has shown, or pollinator mixes underneath. But again, just you're really going to have to think right at the outset how you're going to manage that area. Ben's touched on mulching. Again, really important, combined with maintenance and harvesting. One of my biggest gripes is people get really excited about putting trees in the ground and they think all the hard work is done when they've planted those trees. That's just the start of the hard work. Maintaining those trees is really important if you want to get the value out of them. Good mulching, I think, is really important and is, we're beginning to understand and know more about the benefits of it. But you've also got to think about harvesting. When are you going to harvest the crops? Have you got the equipment? Have you got the skills to do that? And then you can bring all of that together into this very elaborate looking layout plan. This is Harriet Bell's layout at Dartington. So you can see orientation of the rows, spacing of the rows, details about number of trees, spacing within the rows. Interesting things like leaving squirrel sort of buffers around some of the edges to try to minimize squirrel predation. But again, it's a really good layout, well thought through system. And it's good to get it on paper so you can discuss with other people about what's right about it, what's wrong, what might work and what won't work. Just going back to protection, a few examples. The tree cages on the left up in Cumbria got a number of trees planted in them, but they'll probably set you back about £80 per cage, so they're very expensive. The ones over on the left, and apologies for the horrible picture of me in it, they're sort of plastic netting, which is cut. They're on David Rose's farm just outside Nottingham. He's got a men's shed collection. They meet on a Thursday and they've been cutting and preparing all these cages. So they'll probably, with the stakes, you'll probably turn them out planted for about £15 each, still quite expensive and quite fiddly to get. You've got to think about how you're going to get into the garden to do your pruning, do your collection. So we're still working on developing the prototypes for these. We haven't got it right yet. I talked about how you're going to think about how your farm business is going to be affected. Worth thinking about your basic farm payments if you receive them, trying to make sure that the trees don't negate still getting those payments. There was some clarification from DEFRA just before Christmas. I think most important, the last statement, as long as 50% of the area is covered underneath the trees is covered by grasses, you're still eligible. But it's worth thinking about all those sorts of things, although hopefully as we go further and further away from Brexit, that will become less and less of a worry. And good maintenance is essential. And Ben, I didn't tell you I'd stolen one of your pictures here, but it just goes to show how important keeping weeds away from your young trees are at the start of the first few years of their growth. So you can see willow mulched here growing really well. Compare it with the willow, which is not being weeded or less weeded and certainly not mulched. Growth rates are completely different. And just think about, again, how are you going to maintain your trees? Have you got the skills to do it? Have you got the time to do it? This is David Rose's farm, Bingham, planted a variety of apple and pear trees. We ran a pruning course there a couple of years ago. Really interesting. But as I said to a few people at the start, I'm still going through that very tortuous learning process. But it's important that you factor this in. So just to sort of finish up, I think it's really important, as I said, give yourself plenty of time to plan. There's loads of really good information out there. Farm Woodland Forum, case studies, technical reports, research, some really good webinars. I was on one last night. Soil Association, somebody has mentioned the Agroforestry Handbook. Really, really good source of information, but some very good other stuff on the website as well. Agricology, again, some really excellent information there. I was just looking at this particular piece of work from Denmark recently, planting designs for organic poultry ranges. Just some really, it may not be applicable for you, but there's always some gems within any of these reports that are certainly worthwhile. Affinet, European-based project, is actually finished now, but there's still some really good information on all sorts of things, tree species choice, shelter belt design, etc. So again, some very good source of information there. And then Woodland Trust, got some good information, some good research information on, I touched on the tree fodder, about the role of trees on pest control and pollination impacts. And we've also got some funding available for agroforestry schemes. Hopefully this year, 2021, we've probably got funding for around about 35,000 trees. We're hoping to open up our website again for new applications, probably April, May time. At the same time, we will also be opening up our schemes, which will fund hedgerows and small woodland areas as well. So finally then, just to wrap up, be really clear on your objectives. What are you hoping to get out of those trees? How are they going to fit into your farm system? Spend time really assessing, understanding your site. Think about soils, topography, access, wind direction. Seek advice. Go and look at people's systems. There's some really good stuff going on, some real innovation going on. Go and talk to them. Look at all the information on the website. Give yourself plenty of time to plan. Don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. My big takeaway, maintain your trees. Really look after them. They can be actually quite expensive to get into the ground, but But if you're going to do that, make sure you look after them well. They won't solve all your problems, but they can be a real valuable asset. So thank you very much. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, John. I know you said you wished you were 20 years younger, but there's definitely 20 years worth of wisdom in there that we've only managed to tap a tiny bit of tonight. But that was really amazing food for thought. So much to think about. Thank you. So I want to say last but not least, but let's say the finale of the evening's entertainment tonight is Andy Dibbin. Andy is the head grower at Abbey Home Farm. And he is also
Hi there, everybody.
Hi.
So yeah, I've got the nice job of following. I'm really lucky. We hadn't liaised at all, but I do actually seem to be following on with some of the correct advice from both of the previous speakers. So I feel a bit more confident now. So yeah, my name's just trying to get the flick onto the next screen. There you go. My name's Andy Dibbin. I'm the head grower at the organic farm shop at Abbey Home Farm, just outside Cirencester in Gloucestershire. It's a 660 hectare farm. We've been certified organic for 30 years. I arrived here 6 years ago, or 7 years ago now, employed as the head grower. I'm in charge of 6 hectares of horticultural cropping. We grow about 80 different crop lines of fruit and veg. We grow it on a field scale, market garden, protected cropping, staffed by apprentices and trainees. We reckon we feed around about 800 to 1,000 people a week. And across the whole farm, we try and supply a full range of English produce, which we produce on site. It's processed on site. It's sold through our farm shop, and it's also eaten on site in the cafe when it's open. So that's me and where I come from. And so why trees? You know, I'm a veg grower. But in fact, before I was a veg grower, this was my first office as an adult, this picture here, which is a beautiful office. And it's an office I'd like to return to one day. But the reason this was my office to start with is that I started off life with my rural trades as a coppice worker, doing coppicing, hedge laying, charcoal making, generally hanging out all day in ancient woodlands surrounded by beautiful trees. So you can imagine it's a lovely office and a little bit less windy than the open field landscape. I progressed from woodland work through sort of general farm work. I was a shepherd for a bit. But I eventually ended up in organic horticulture, and it was in organic horticulture that I came across lovely images like this for the first time. So yeah, you know, you can't but find this beautiful. You know, it's beautiful visually. Once you understand growing, you appreciate the 3-dimensional qualities of this and how you can increase production in a small area. I particularly like the picture on the top right hand with bananas around my vegetables, which maybe with a sweet spot in climate change we might be able to do, but in some ways I hope that doesn't become possible. I eventually ended up working at Abbey Home Farm, where in fact there had already been, like, over the sort of 30-year history, quite a lot of interest and sort of temptation towards bringing agroforestry into the arable side of the farm. But when I arrived, I think my passion for trees generally, and mixed with some influence, Ian Tolhurst had always been our advisor at the farm for the veg. And I've got a long friendship with Ben Raskin. He's also very passionate about his agroforestry. So it was a bit of a natural progression for us to move into agroforestry. So once we were sure we were kind of interested in moving into these things, we made some investigations into whether we could secure some funding. We were sort of directed towards the Woodland Trust by Ben and by Tolly. And at the time, I think it's still running, is the PUR project funded by Accor Hotels at the Woodland Trust. And we're just testing the waters. We had a bit of a chat with the Woodland Trust. Initial discussions seemed quite positive, and we were encouraged to put an application forward. The application was, if we were successful with the application, it was going to pay for all the cost of the trees and all of the materials, but not the labour. Luckily, the one thing we're quite strong with all the apprentices on site is we have a lot of labour. So actually, the cost of the trees and the materials being picked up was really the one we were looking for. So we started putting together a detailed proposal. I mean, this was for 2 main reasons. One, which has already been touched on, it was to really focus our minds on whether this was the right thing for us to do on the farm in the long term. You know, putting in big hardwood trees, this isn't a short-term approach. If you ever want to get rid of them, that's quite a major effort. And it's not really that kind of right on at the moment to dig trees out once you put them in. So we wanted to make sure it was the right decision and they went in the right place in the right system. It was also going to be, very necessary for any grant application to have a really good, well thought out proposal put together. So, as has been mentioned already, one of the key things is, why did we want to do it? So for me, funnily enough, when we started looking at agroforestry, I think, I don't know if it was showing up in your pictures, but actually this is the field just over the hedge from my veg production. There's actually a wind turbine in this picture, and you don't put wind turbines where there's no wind. So we're actually on a really windy site, and wherever I farm, it seems to be windy. And actually, with climate change going forward, one of the big noticeable things is wind speeds are just going up and up and up. And especially with veg, this can be a real problem. So we knew that once we got an agroforestry system established, it would significantly reduce the wind in the cropping areas, leading to better yields and higher quality produce. Reducing the wind would also lead to reduced water loss through evaporation, so reduce our water usage from our irrigation system. Reducing wind in cropping areas will also raise temperatures. This has also been covered earlier on this evening. And then there's all the other horticultural benefits of having trees around your crops. So crops will also benefit from nutrients being recycled from depth by the tree roots. And I'm not going to go into the rest of this too much. The list of horticultural benefits are quite extensive. As we said, mycorrhizal relationships. The other ones we're really interested in as far as horticultural benefits are concerned is we're passionate in the shop about trying to do a full range of English produce that can be produced. So the first reason was to provide better protection from our existing crops. Once we decided we want to plant trees, it was then what could the trees also bring us on top of the horticultural benefits? So for us, that was, what things we're passionate about, trying to produce not a completely closed system, but as closed a system as possible and as many home produced crops as possible. And the two things we identified very early on, we buy in a lot of apples and other fruit like plums and pears, but we also still buy in a lot of wood chip. We buy in a lot of compost. And at the times we were sort of looking into the agroforestry initially, wood chip subject for composting was just starting to build up. And at the same time, through Tolly, who's our consultant, we were just starting to get the first sort of hints of the whole ramial wood chip thing as well. So the two end products from the trees really we were looking at was fruit crops and wood chip. So the other benefits of the trees, because there's masses of benefits, as an organic grower, in organic systems, wildlife is critical. It's a key tool for producing healthy crops. On the wider farm, Abbey Home Farm has been passionate about sharing the land with wildlife all the way through its history. The arable side's won multiple awards from FWAG for the efforts put into wildlife, and we wanted to mimic that in the veg areas as well. And from these pictures here, these are the benefits. Trees will bring in birds of prey, which will control your rabbits and your small mammal populations. Songbirds will come into the trees, they'll eat the caterpillars, they'll eat the slugs. Ground beetles will live in the understory, they'll control your slugs. Pollinators will come in onto the blossom in the trees in the spring, and they'll then move on to pollinate your crops through the season. And then beneficial insects galore will live in the understory and live in the trees. And these, as an organic farmer, these are my replacement for insecticides. So there's all of these massive benefits for encouraging wildlife in amongst and over the top of my crops. We're also passionate about education at the farm. We right from a small scale up to a large scale. So by that I mean we've got a preschool nursery on site. You can see from the lovely pictures here. We've got a mainstream education set up through what we call the Farm Project, which brings in kids from a lot of inner city schools and shows them the countryside and farming. And then we do a lot of public engagement through campsites, holiday lets, farm tours. I run an apprenticeship scheme. So that there's public engagement and education at all levels. And we felt that trees would just add another fantastic element to all this education. And then last, but I don't think least, is just the simple visual impact of trees. A flat, barren agricultural landscape might be beautiful to growers, but to the general less informed public, it can be that. It can be flat and barren. The field we looked to establish the agroforestry in was right in front of our cafe, right in front of the veranda and in front of the shop, and was going to be looked at by all our customers who come in and use the shop and the cafe. So, from blossom in the spring, autumnal colour, architectural shape of trees in the winter, it's another massive bonus, that we could bring into the farm. So with all of these in mind, it came on to choosing the trees, and the parameters we set ourselves for choosing the trees. They must deliver on our aims. So that was wind protection, improve soil health, introduce fruit crops, wood chip production, biodiversity, and visual impact. They must work on our soil type. So we're on Cotswold Brash. It's a challenging but fertile soil. It's shallow, it's stony, it's high in pH in places. The trees must fit in with the intended location. So with this particular project on the farm, this was to go into a mixed rotational horticultural cropping area. So we wanted to avoid large, heavy shaders. We wanted to avoid extensive shallow rooters. We wanted to avoid trees that excessively sucker. And we wanted to avoid lots of very thirsty trees. We didn't mind having a few in there, but we didn't want the whole thing. An example of this would be willow. So I had looked into some research from Wakelins, and there was some evidence of the short rotation willow having some negative effects in very dry years on the surrounding crops. I'll come on to willow a bit more because there's loads of positives of willow as well. We just didn't want to go all willow. It must also be a diverse mix of native trees. You know, these are part of the grant stipulations, but we also believe that it's the best habitat for UK wildlife. And generally, native trees grow best in our climate, but I have to say our climate is changing fast. So that last point may be one that might not ring true in 10 years. So apples were to be a main sort of end source of the trees. And like was alluded to by the last speaker, advice is critical. For me, apples was a completely new subject. I knew about apples, I liked eating apples, but producing apples commercially was a completely new subject. So there are various people we got advice on. The two amazing sources of advice we got. We went to visit Rachel and Martin Sobel at Carey Organics in Herefordshire, who've got a large commercial organic orchard they've been setting up for quite a while. They were fantastic. They gave us a whole day of their time. They basically did a brain dump of all the knowledge they've gained over years. And the real thing we wanted from Rachel and Martin was that commercial edge. You know, they tried lots of different trees. There were some great trees. The apples tasted great, but they didn't give the commercial yields, or they weren't good in an organic system because they weren't good with different diseases and pests. And then the other person we got a lot of fantastic information off was Kevin O'Neill at Walcott Organic Nursery. So he supplies all our fruit trees generally, and we got very involved with him early on, and he really was absolutely fantastic source of knowledge, and still is whenever we need to pick someone's brain about fruit trees. So the aim for the apple crop was to keep shopping continuous supply of apples from August until March. The maths on this is the shop requires an average of 100 kilos of apples per week. On average, one tree at full maturity will give us about 50 kilos of apples. Due to the exposed site, soil type, and not spraying, we were assuming 25% less on that yield. So the totals we came out with: supply period of 37 weeks, required apple yield was, give or take, 3,700 kilos. We worked this out to be about 98 trees with full seasonal succession, and storage being a big part of it. Obviously, the apples we were going to sell from like late October through to March weren't going to be coming straight off the trees. They had to be storage varieties that we could store through till March. On pest and disease, we picked all the varieties as selected for scab resistance where possible. We really, I mean, even still a lot of organic fruit growers still use sprays on derogations. We really passionately don't want to use any sprays. We don't want any of the veg crops or arable crops. We never derogate for chemicals, and we want it to stay that way. And we accept we might get reduced yield and quality as a result. However, on a 30-year organic farm, we do have fantastic insect species. So our natural predator population is great. So we hope this is going to buffer that a little bit. So this is what we came out with. So these are the varieties of apples, the number of apples. The blocks in black are when we intend to sell that variety, although they'll be cropped and stored, as you can see by the grey strips. Yeah, so I won't go too much into detail there. I'm sure this will be shared later date, so please pick this for your own use and knowledge. But I have to say, it's picked specifically for our site with our requirements in mind. But a lot of these varieties, and obviously the successional order, would be relevant on other organic farms. So onto the hardwood varieties. So as I said, in my previous career, I was a coppice worker, you know, and I've worked on a lot of different trees in really nice coppices around the country. And I came away from that with a good knowledge on how coppice behaves and what the different trees can offer us. And some key things here, you know, half the hardwood trees going in were going to be coppice species. These were being put in as a crop as much as anything else. And we were going to coppice these trees. We're going to wood chip them. We're going to apply straight from the lines of trees as ramial wood chip. But we're also going to save some of that back to make wood chip compost for propagating with and for our protected cropping areas. So the main coppice trees people talk about really is from a coppicing perspective are sweet chestnut, which is quite a long cycle and it doesn't really like alkaline soils, hazel, alder and willow. So willow has a lot of positives. So especially if we're putting in apple trees, there's a lot of interesting information at the moment about willow being used as a mulch. So you chip the willow, you use it as a mulch, and it's got anti-scab qualities, or it stimulates the natural defense mechanisms in trees to deal with scab. So I was very interested in this. But like I said, I was worried about how thirsty willows can get. And with increasingly dry summers, I didn't want it to be the mainstay of my production. The other thing to say is I wanted to match the coppicing cycle, so the length of time between coppicing the trees, with the rotation cycle. Now, willow grows very, very fast, which requires a relatively quick coppicing cycle. And I wanted a good windbreak through the rotation to protect my crops. Hazel and alder are a longer coppicing cycle than willow. In fact, when I looked into the science behind it, over the same time length, hazel will produce the same biomass as willow because it's a much denser wood. So although you might coppice willow twice at the same height, hazel's a much denser wood and gives you the same biomass. So although something grows faster, it doesn't necessarily mean you get more biomass. So onto the other trees. So I said 50% of the hardwoods we were going to plant would be those coppice varieties. And then these are the other varieties we chose to use. So wild cherry, lovely early blossom. We knew it thrived on our farm. It grows everywhere on the farm really, really well. So it likes our soils. We're not going to crop these. The fruit on these, well, we get lots of fruit on our wild cherries, but the fruit on these is going to be for the wildlife. The blossom will bring in the insects. They look fantastic. We'll let them grow up into standards. They won't get coppiced. Elder, probably the worst timber wood in the country, but we're not growing it for timber wood. We're growing it for what you see there. We have a cafe. We can make elderflower cordial. There's a nice succession in the flowering of these plants. So, you know, what we find is cherry will go. Well, in fact, our pussy willow at the farm now is flowering now. Cherry's not going to be far long behind that. Elder will come after that. And the bottom right-hand corner, something not many people speak about really, is spindle. So again, this grows fantastically on our soils here. It's in all of our woodlands. And this flowers really late and produces a berry crop really late in the season. Fantastic for wildlife. And counterintuitively, spindle is a favorite of aphids. Now, that might worry some people in a veg situation. For me, I want aphids because aphids will attract in predators. So essentially, this is a trap tree for aphids. It'll attract them in and it'll become a breeding ground for predatory insects within the cropping area. And then white willow in there as well. So having chosen the trees, we needed to decide on what the layout was going to be. So basically, the things we took into consideration were aspect. So we wanted to crop north to south to maximize light onto our crops. The field we were putting them into actually was east to west when we made these decisions. So we actually had to take the field out of production for 2 years, turn the cropping around to north to south, and then put in the trees and reintroduce the cropping. Rotation, so we're organic growers, we're very into rotation. It was logical to use the alley cropping system to mark out our different rotational areas. One of our primary desires was as a windbreak. Now, the rough science of it is a good windbreak will cast a wind shadow, an effective wind lessening effect for 10 times the distance of the height of the tree. So for us, this meant that we could probably get a rotational area into a 50-meter wide strip. And at the moment, that's the distance we've put in between our trees. It's about 50 meters between the trees. And then there was some basic maths governing the layout. Okay, and we're very into a whole system approach here. We like things to be efficient, and we already got a good system, and we didn't want to introduce trees which would disrupt the existing system. So the basic maths for our system is our bed widths are 1.5 meters. So we wanted the gap between the trees to be divisible by this. Our irrigation boom width, which is a really efficient targeted way of irrigating, especially on a windy site and increasing windy times. We prefer using the boom to sprinklers because it directs water at the ground, not up in the air. That runs at 11 beds wide, and it runs at just over 100-meter long runs. And then crop mesh, 100 meters long, 4 beds wide for immature crops. But the important thing here is we also use it on mature crops. So once a brassica crop like Brussels sprouts or purple sprout and broccoli or kale crops later in the year, when the pigeons come back to the land, we sometimes have to put meshes over it. Intelligently, actually, the mesh covers 3 beds. It doesn't cover 4 beds. It will do that on a low growing crop, but not on a mature brassica crop. Irrigation, so the ability to irrigate tree crops simultaneously with vegetable crops is particularly important with young trees and fruit trees. You know, fruit trees always need some water for the cropping. We've got quite a free draining soil. It's very stony. And even with this in mind, we have had some problems establishing young trees. In the last 4 years with the trees going in, we've had some significant early spring droughts, which if you've just done a round of tree planting are very challenging. And then there's allowances for increasing spread of trees. So we don't know how these trees are going to grow. I can't quite picture how the coppice varieties are going to spread in an open environment. In a woodland environment, they grow quite straight up because they're competing for light. In a field scale environment, in single rows, I expect they're going to be wider. So we did build in some sort of allowances to slightly change the distance between the tree lines, or what we do between the tree lines, depending on how the habit of the trees when they grew. And then I think something that a lot of people forget, understory. So we planned and established our understory at or before tree planting. So we knew what we wanted to put there before we planted the trees. And this is what we decided to use for our understory, which is we've just gone for a Cotswold wildflower mix. You know, we're veg growers. Insects are probably one of our biggest challenges. And our biggest defense against, well, I'd say bad insects. I don't say that. The biggest defense against insects we don't want eating our crops is other predatory insects. And we've just grown the same wildflowers that grow under the hedgerows, grow on the roundabouts, and grow on the road verges around us. We're very lucky. It's a very rich floral part of the country, the Cotswolds, but we haven't done anything targeted. We've just gone for a broad spectrum wildflower mix underneath the trees. So putting all that maths together and putting up some slightly more technical pictures, less pretty, what we ended up was, this was our system basically. Each of the white areas is 1 boom wide. In between the booms, and this is a slight buffer to allow for different wind directions and a little bit of spray drift off the irrigation boom, we have annual wildflower strips. So I can set the boom up a bed to the left or a bed to the right. And we've got 3 cropping areas there. So that's 3 boom widths. It's 100 meters long, which matches the boom, and it matches our mesh length. And then the trees on either side, on the big green strips, they are apple trees, coppice trees, and wildlife trees, all mixed with undersowing with perennial wildflower. And spacing wise, we've gone for 1.5 meters between all the hardwoods, and then a 3-meter gap either side of the apple trees. And then this is an overview of the field. I wanted to get a drone shot off my farm manager, but it's been very windy for days. But basically, this is a little bit of a bird's eye view. On the left-hand side of your screen, that's our cafe and our residential education building. We then got a little small rotation there with the short beds, which they're all split up by apples, which have just got plain tusky grass beetle banks underneath. And then we've got a 5-year rotation. I have got a field next door, which will allow me to lengthen the rotation, but this field is rabbit fenced at the moment. So we're focusing in here. You'll notice a few things here. It's a 5-year rotation. The tree lines, we could have set it up so they went all the way down the field, okay? But if you look at the light green lines, these are our access routes into the field. The irrigation boom runs up and down the middle green line. It swivels 180 degrees, so it's very efficient to irrigate in either direction without having to tow it up and around the field loads. This also, those veg growers who handle mesh all the time, it's a bit of a pain to move around. This allows us to move, basically, mesh from this bit to this bit, to this bit, to this bit, to this bit, in an efficient crisscross mechanism. beware of mesh and agroforestry. It suddenly becomes a different animal to move. The next thing with coppicing is, I think this is the right name, is phasing. So you're working out how you match your coppice sequence to your crop sequence. So this is hazel coppice here, and how much it grows. This is established mature hazel coppice. And I think all your planning has to be around your mature crops and what they're going to be doing in 10, 15 years time, these trees. So this is how much height you get off the coppice trees over a certain number of years. And so within that in mind, this is how our trees and our rotation interact. So rotation year one, the coppice trees are their full height. Okay, we've just gone into our first year fertility. We've got 6 meter high coppice trees there or thereabouts. At the end of that first year fertility, we coppice the trees and we're going to apply them as ram your wood chip onto that fertility. Year two, we now have no windbreak. We've just cut them down. Doesn't matter. Clovers, grasses don't really need a windbreak. We've done the difficult bit of establishing them. So in the first year, when we sow the fertility, there is a windbreak to sort of help us establish young fertility crops. Year two, we don't need that windbreak. We've established it. We don't need to water second year fertility really. Year three, back into cropping. So we've got a low windbreak, it's about 3 meters, but it'll be casting quite a lot of wind shadow by this point. Year four, again, alliums not so critical for wind protection, but because they don't cast any shade, you get a lot of evaporation of soil of your water. So that windbreak, not so much to stop the winds the crops being blown around, but actually it's dropping that water transpiration and evaporation from the soil, which is quite important with allium crops. And then this is the critical one for actual wind speed protection. Sweet corn hates wind, gets flattened by strong winds. And if you look at the bottom, you know, the height of the coppice at this point is 5 meters. So times 10, 50 meters, that's going to give us good full coverage wind protection across the whole area. So sweet corn gets protected from the wind. Winter squash crop hate wind. They get rattled around without fail every year. However much we study the weather, as soon as we sow our squash crop, the forecast changes and high winds come on the forecast. Around about early May, mid-May, we always get a windy period. So actually the squash really needs that wind protection. And then beetroot, well, our main crop beetroot, it's of all the things we direct sow, it's sowed quite late in the year, and keeping moisture in the soil is difficult at that time of year. So again, the wind protection in year 5 allows us to sow our main crop beetroot and just drop that wind speed, hopefully, and lock some moisture into the soil. So that is how the coppice is meant to interact with the crop, with the rotation. And the key thing from here, we're not coppicing the whole row. It's the alders and the hazels that are being coppiced, the cherries, some of the willows, the elders, the spindles. They'll be left to grow to full size. So there'll always be some wind protection. There'll always be some wildlife habitat. There'll always be some visual qualities and some soil health qualities, but 50% will be going up and down through the coppice cycle. So the sequence of planting went like this. So year one, we reorientated the field while applying for the grant with the Woodland Trust. In the autumn of 2017, still year one, we ploughed and cultivated and established the understory for all the tree plantings. Year two, early spring 2018, we planted our first 50 apple trees while we were waiting for approval for the grant. We paid for these ourselves because we were just keen to get on with it. We began to re-establish horticulture into the field at this point. Year three, autumn 2018, we received our grant approval and prepared the next lot of understory strips. Year four, spring 2019, we planted the remaining 57 apple trees and 200 hardwoods. Year four, autumn 2019, early rains in the autumn. I don't remember 2019, it was horrific. Winter started in late autumn and late August, all of our autumn activities were scuppered. Harvesting potatoes was a nightmare. Getting in overwintered crops was a nightmare. And one of our overwintered crops was meant to be the understory for the final lot of agroforestry planting. That was a pain. We never got that in. I didn't want to damage the soil just to get in some wildflowers. So we're still trying to re-establish that after planting now. And then year five, spring 2020, we planted the remaining 200 hardwoods, and that's us all planted up. So protection, Apples, our main worries about protecting apples with deer and rabbits. So this is what we've gone for. We start with stock net guards and spiral guards. So stock net allows you to get your hands in there, prune young apple trees. It allows you to mulch quite easily. You can kind of get the wood chip through the mesh around the base of the tree. The spiral guards are there to stop the rabbits from going through the mesh. And then long term, again, this was advice from Walcott Nurseries. He came out to the site and had a walk around. We talked about roe deer, and he suggested a technique. And it'd be interesting to have some input. I don't know what Ben knows about this, but he suggested that if we pruned the apple trees high and got them to start cropping quite high up, roe deer don't like reaching up to browse on trees. They like to browse at head height and below. So he was advising us to prune the apple trees up high for where they first start cropping, which allowed us to do the picture you see on the right, which I'm not sure if it's showing too well, but we're basically going to keep all side growth of the apples pruned off to quite high. And then we're going to replace the stock net guards with a plastic tree tube just to stop the trunk being ring barked. And then on hardwoods, so deer and rabbits, again, the same problem. We went straight for plastic tree guards. When we get to maturity on these trees, the one worry we're still going to have is with the coppice species. Now, when I was a coppice worker, what we used to do is we'd cut all the product off the trees. We keep the nice thick stems. We'd sell those, not for much money, but that's what we were cropping and selling. And then all the thin brash, we piled back on top of the coppice stalls. And again, what we'd learned off the older boy coppices is that roe deer don't like walking through piles of trash, and they don't like sticking their heads through trash to eat stuff. So actually, when we finished coppicing woodlands, you wouldn't be able to walk across it. It would just be a pile of brash, and that would act as deer protection. So that is a system that we're going to try here in the field. But again, this is going to be, we're talking like 8, 9, 10 years before we get to try this out. And then the last thing is voles. Now, this is definitely a big issue. I'm starting to see some impact on the trees now from voles. I've been tending them all this month, and there's definitely a lot of vole activity. We do have really good birds of prey populations on the farm. So we're hoping the installation of perches will help with this. But any advice on voles? I know, Ben, you might have had some problems. I know Tolly's had some problems. And then other subjects for consideration. Weed control and tending. So I've now made February my tree month. It's, it's still relatively quiet in terms of veg world. I finished planning. We're starting to propagate stuff, but we haven't really got going and motoring on the veg. So it's a good time of my year. And I really focused the whole of February on trees. So I apply my wood chip mulch to all the trees in February. I check all the tree guards. We remove them, give the trees a bit of a weed in case they've got grasses inside the tubes. February's also when I check all the protections still in place, and it's also when I prune all the fruit trees. Irrigation. I can't emphasize how important being able to irrigate your trees is. Our summers are getting drier and drier. We get a drought 2 and 3 years now, and the droughts are becoming very early in the season. It's not in autumn. It's not in the height of summer. It tends to be in spring we're getting droughts. And this is just as the trees are in a really dynamic phase and they really need water. So what I've learned over the years is definitely plan to need to irrigate your trees. It can still be a problem. And so the other thing we've worked out is when you're a bit late planting and you plant in like late February or early March, the trees really can't handle a drought and they struggle. When you get them in nice, good time, like late January, early February, they seem to be able to cope with the droughts a bit better. I suspect because a few bouts of winter rain have settled the soil around the roots so that they're bedded in and they've got better access to water. And then last slide. So what for the future? So yeah, more trees. I think really outside with the agroforestry, I'd like to see the system we put in bed in properly, learn all the lessons I need to learn, see how it interacts, refine it if we're going to spread it out or repeat it anywhere else. We've just put up quite a large glass house at the farm, and it was interesting what Ben was saying about Nathan. We're very interested in doing some agroforestry in the glass house. And for us, obviously there's no wind issues in the glass house, so it's not for wind protection. When we were talking to the glasshouse contractors, they said one of the first things we'd be going back to them for with current climate change would be shading screens in the glasshouse. With sun and heat getting higher and higher, it's actually like sunlight levels and heat become a serious problem in the height of summer. Now, I've looked at there's some interesting stuff going on at Dartington in a glass house there with 3-dimensional cropping. Now, I'm interested in using, we can introduce peaches and nectarines into the glass house, possibly figs, possibly kiwis. And again, for me, actually, the thing I'm most interested in is possibly using these vertical crops as a form of natural shading. So especially deciduous crops, they'll come out in leaf in the summer and add shading, but they'll lose their leaves in winter and therefore not rob us of any critical sunlight in the winter. And that is me done. So yeah, there we go.
Amazing. Thank you, Andy. I think as soon as the lockdown restrictions are lifted, we should just all head down to Abbey Home Farm and have a proper nosy around. It sounds amazing. We have had a few questions and we have still got a little bit of time, but I'm going to throw some questions at you all, panelists. The first one is actually anonymous, and it is, could you give us examples of your biggest mistakes? That would be really valuable. We can learn from you. I'm assuming they mean agroforestry related biggest mistakes, but interpret it as you will. Yes, Ben, do you want to go first? Any mistakes you're prepared to admit to?
Oh, we make lots of mistakes. Yeah. I'm very happy to share them, start other people making them. So at Eastbrook, we're on quite heavy clay, and it's quite heavy planting into. So we thought, great, what we'll do is we'll get a subsoiler and we'll create a nice slit through the row where we want to plant, and that will make it really easy to plant, and it will break up the soil a bit so the roots will get down nicely. And the first year that worked really well. And the second year we were planting in sort of winter 2017-18. And of course we had the drought and the cracks just opened up. They were 3-4 foot deep, some of these cracks. So we lost, and we can't irrigate. We're not landed. We don't have irrigation systems there. So we couldn't irrigate. So we did lose a lot of trees. What we found, interestingly, was that trees that went in at the beginning of January mostly survived, and trees that we got a wood chip mulch on mostly survived. The ones that went in February and the ones that weren't mulched, we tended to lose. So even having that extra, as Andy was saying, even having sort of extra month or so in the ground seemed to help.
Yeah. My biggest mistake, I guess, is similar really, but also related to sheep. So planting at David Rose's, part of the site was very heavy clay. Those trees that weren't mulched really suffered from early spring drought. But what we experienced as well, being on a clay site, the clay just shrank as it dried, and that almost made some of the protection redundant because it opened up cracks around we double staked everything, so the stakes were just really loose, and when sheep went back in there, they just back up to them, rub them, push them over. So big learning there. And just, I was really interested in what Andy was saying about the guards, the mesh guards that he used. With the plastic ones that we started out with, it was impossible, well, really fiddly to open them up, get your hands in to start pruning them, shut them up again. It was a real faff. So yeah, some lessons there.
So the mesh guards, to follow on from that, I wish, and I need to come up, we're on a really windy site. I wish I'd either made those mesh guards a little bit wider, because what we're finding is on really strong windy days, the trees are bending over and rubbing on the tops of those mesh guards. And I've got a few trees, there's a few apple trees I'm particularly concerned about. Now, that's just refinement. I kind of feel like maybe I need to find some sort of top ring to put round them, or they need to be wider. You know how on the plastic tubes, they're flared at the top, and that's what stops that happening on the plastic tubes. On those metal wire, they're not designed to be smooth around the top. Where the wire joins vertical to horizontal, there's little little ties where the wire joins on the stock net, and there's quite a lot of friction in there. So that is definitely something I'd like to identify and a solution for. And the other one is, I feel like on some of the rows, I should have been more honest especially on the corners of where we got vehicle access, been more honest to myself about cutting corners with tractors and trailers and the resultant compaction. And there are certain trees I'm looking at now and went, that ain't never going to work, that tree. And I should probably just give up tending it now, because it's just that natural drive line. You know, no matter how many times you tell people not to cut corners, even myself, you're in a hurry or you get rutted tracks that you can't get out of. So actually just giving the trees a little bit more space on the access routes and the corners is something that I definitely attend to as well.
Brilliant, thank you all. I'm getting lots of questions coming in now, but we are going to run out of time, so I might even ask the presenters to have a quick look at them after we're done. But let's go for one specifically for Andy from Anya, who says, could you say something about labour increase after the system was set up?
Yeah, so yeah, there's definitely, I mean, there's a labour increase now, but I mean, to be honest, I would say the planting required a lot of labour. We're from the first trees being planted, we're year 4 now, I think we are. And actually, it's not the numbers of trees we've put in, and they're relatively close to home. It's not a vast amount. I reckon we probably do, apple pruning aside, and actually the ones that take the time of the older ones, which aren't part of that system. So right now, I reckon I've probably added about 4 man days or lady days, whoever's doing it, to the process. But I tell you what, in 10 years' time, there's a hell of a lot of apple pruning out there. And that's my retirement job, hopefully, is that I'm just going to prune apples and then go surfing.
That sounds great. This might be a quick one. Vivian asked, how close do rows have to be to reduce wind speeds and reduce winter chill? A quick answer to that.
Well, I mean, like I was saying, from my research, and I think it depends on, like John was saying before, about how you plant the trees, what trees, how thick the shelter belts. But from what I managed to glean off the internet, it was 10 times the height of the tree you were getting wind protection from. And ideally, like John said, multi-species, multi-heights, and not necessarily, in fact, I think the evidence is if you have an incredibly dense cover of trees, it actually creates some turbulence on the other side that can flatten crops. You need some wind to pass through the trees to negate that turbulence effect.
Yeah, there was just very quickly, there was but there still is a really interesting guy. John Davis used to have a nursery in the Gloucestershire area, produced a wonderful little leaflet about practical how to do a good windbreak. So I'll try and dig it out and share it with you, Greta. You can put it on the website.
Great, thank you. This might be one for you, Ben. I know this is one of your favourite subjects. Peter asked, can we hear more detail about ramial mulching, please, e.g. timing? I bet you could do another 90 minutes on this.
Yeah, I mean, there is, well, so I did post a link to the couple of wood chip Facebook pages. There's also Organic Research Centre did a webinar on ramial wood chip, which is worth reading as well, which was sort of talking about their 3-year project they did. But broadly speaking, for those who don't know, it's ramial wood chip is the stuff that comes from tree branches that are less than 7 centimetres in diameter. And they've got this higher nitrogen content effectively, which means that you don't get so much risk of nitrogen robbing. You can apply them to the soil directly, whereas more mature wood chips you would tend to compost before you put them on the soil. That's not to say there's no risk of sort of unwanted soil interactions, but it seems in most cases that you can spread them straight onto the soil, and they build soil health. They encourage worm activity. They increase the fungal bacterial ratio, or the fungal bit of the ratio. So there's a lot of evidence that they're pretty good for soil health, I would recommend, I mean, we could spend hours on it. I would recommend looking up the outputs from the Organic Research Centre WOOFS project, which is WOOFS, they've produced 3 brilliant guides. I'll before the thing's over, I'll post a link to it. There's 3 really good guides on it, and there's stuff about timing within that. So Tolly, for instance, spreads them onto his lay phase, but the other farmers were spreading them directly onto the soil because that's what worked for them. So I think there's some flexibility, but I'll post a link to the guides.
Brilliant, thank you. We could keep going for quite a long time, I think, so I'm going to call a halt. But thank you very much, particularly to Ben and John and Andy, for all your time and experience. It's such an honour to get to hear all of that wisdom that's in your head. Thank you also to the other partners, Sinead and Susie behind the scenes, and to everybody who's joined us tonight for all the great sharing you've been doing in the chat. It's been fascinating to watch it spinning past me. We are going to be running more of these types of events this year and into next year. The next one is actually in March. I'll just post a quick link to it here. It is going to be digging deep into no dig, and it's hosted by the CSA network. I'll also be emailing you all tomorrow with a link to the recording of this session. I'll include the link to that event there as well. I'll also send you a link to a feedback form. It'd be great to get your opinions on tonight's session and also any suggestions for future sessions, either spin-offs from this one that you want more detail on or something completely different that would be helpful to you. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying till the end. And yes, huge thank you to our presenters. Enjoy planting your trees.